Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the weekly masterclass hosted by Climate Asia. And so we have a very important and special speaker and guest today for this masterclass. The topic is on systems thinking in systems to achieve long-term strategy for India in terms of achieving the climate goals. This topic and this masterclass happening today is also coming at the right time when COP is happening in Egypt. And I think you must have seen in the news that India is going to also talk about the long-term strategy in the coming days. And I think this masterclass especially is also very important to understand how as a nation, as a country, one builds their strategy towards the climate goals and what does it take. And we have Dr. Indu Murthy from C-STEP today to unpack this for us. Welcome, Dr. Murthy. So I'll quickly introduce our speaker before we start. So Dr. Indu Murthy is the sector head for climate, environment and sustainability at C-STEP, a think tank in Bangalore. She completed her bachelor's in botany from Etiraj College for Women, Chennai, master's in botany from MS University, Baroda, with specialization in forestry and environment, and has a PhD in ecology and environmental sciences from Pondicherry University. Prior to joining C-STEP, she worked as a consulting scientist at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Her areas of interest include climate change vulnerability, land-based mitigation and adaptation resilience building, or climate proofing development to climate change. Dr. Murthy is also on the governing board of South Asia Consortium for Interdisciplinary Water Resources Studies, and she's also a member of the Technical Advisory Committee of Mahila Abhivruddhi Society of Andhra Pradesh. Welcome, Dr. Murthy, and we have a very general audience, a lot of young people from non-profit world and corporate world who are interested in the climate action space and sustainability in general. Climate Asia's aim is to bring experts like yours to sort of unpack this whole ecosystem, the complex ecosystem, for all of us to understand it better and contribute better. Thank you so much for your time today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kaushik, for that introduction, and very good morning to everyone. Very happy to be here and being able to speak with you all. Thanks to Kaushik for inviting me to be here. So without much ado, I'll jump in directly. I have a few slide deck that I'm going to share to kind of walk you through the thinking itself, and then try and kind of bring to the focus as to why it's extremely important to have the system thinking in place, particularly when you're looking at long-term strategies, and more so from a developing country perspective like India. So it becomes extremely important to look at it from that perspective. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen, my presentation, and then I think we can get into it directly. Kaushik, I have about 25 to 30 minutes. Would that be okay? Or more than that?
Yeah, I think that would be okay, Dr. Murthy, and then we can get into the question and answers.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Can you confirm my screen is visible?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you. So just to kind of set the context, and like Kaushik already kind of spoke about it, we all know or we are experiencing ourselves that the climate is changing, and it's here and it's now. Gone are the days, when people around the world, including the politicians, be the scientists, say that climate is going to be changing. So let's start working towards halting the change itself by doing ABC, different kinds of things. But then we have the science now, which very clearly established that we must limit the warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade if we have to prevent increasingly dangerous and irreversible climate change impacts. And on the other side, we also have science which tells us that we need to protect, sustainably manage and restore the ecosystems for halting biodiversity loss, which again translates to lives and livelihoods at the end of the day, because there is a whole lot of climate sensitive sectors out there. So obviously, with changes happening, with biodiversity getting impacted, the interlinkage between the lives and the livelihoods, the jobs, etc., is all going to be impacted. Now, to achieve this, what we need is a fundamental change across practically every sector, every system in place, be it building, be it power, be it industry, or the natural resource sectors like agriculture or forest for that matter, needs to be managed differently. They need to be looked at from a very different lens. It also requires very important transformations in the political, social, and economic systems because, we need to ensure that the changes are sustainable, but at the same time, they're also socially inclusive and equitable. So this is a multi-pronged challenge at the end of the day that the world is looking at today. And right now, as Kaushik rightly said, there's this conference of parties that's happening at Egypt where the world leaders discussed during the initial days, but then there are other people out there, hundreds and thousands of people who are out there discussing how do we address this problem. There are key things like climate finance, loss and damage, stock take as to what the world is doing, what the countries around the world are doing. Is it enough? Do we need to do more? Do we need to have legally binding commitments and so on and so forth? But that apart, we know that a lot of countries have made some policy changes with respect to addressing the issue of climate change and, of course, for development as it is. So when you look at India's position in this entire context, India's climate policy ambition is proactive and it's rooted in two key considerations. One is, first of all, we need to recognize that we have very low per capita emissions as compared to the rest of the world, because we've consumed far less so far, and while trying to meet the developmental goals, it's kind of increasing today, but at the same time, we're still much lower than the rest of the world. And but at the same time, we do seek to be part of the solution because we are one of the most vulnerable countries with respect to climate change. The kind of extreme rainfall events, heat waves, droughts that have been triggered in the recent past, and as a result, the amount of damage that's happened within India, even earlier this year for that matter, heat waves and floods is something that rest of the world, including India, has faced. So which makes it a very vulnerable nation and obviously very important to kind of be a part of the solution. So keeping this in mind, at COP21 in Paris, India committed to achieving its developmental objectives in a low carbon intensive manner. And this was affirmed by India announcing what is called as the nationally determined contributions. This is not a legally binding commitment, but it's just a voluntary declaration that we are going to do something about it. So the policy landscape in India with respect to this spans to the NDC commitment, or the nationally determined contribution commitment, post the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was to reduce the emission intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030. The second was to increase its share of fossil fuel free electricity generation, so non-fossil generation, to 40% by 2030, and also creating what is called as an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest and tree cover. And just earlier this year, a couple of months back in August 2022, like the rest of the countries across the world, India updated its NDC commitment. And what does it say? It talks about reducing emissions intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030, as opposed to the prior commitment of 33 to 35% compared to the 2005 level. It also talks about achieving 50% of its cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy resources by 2030. Now, amidst all of this is also India's stated aspirational GDP growth of 8.3% in the initial NDC document. So on the one hand, we have development, on the other hand, we have climate. And this is where the balancing act begins. So you have the climate goals, India's commitment to the Paris Agreement and also the net zero announcement in the COP26 saying that India would achieve net zero by 2070. But at the same time, being a developing country with a huge population, yet to achieve a whole lot of basic needs that are required for growth itself. You need better quality of life, you need economic growth to achieve that, and human developmental goals. So it's a very fine balancing act that needs to be achieved. But interestingly, much of the narratives, much of the modeling have been in silos. You know, people look at development, people look at climate independently without actually looking at it in conjunction. Now, there is a problem with that kind of a narrative, which we will look into as we move forward. So now, before we get into how we do it, let's just take a step back and see that, you know, why do we need to be doing what I call as the systems change. Now, I talked about climate related goals. I also talked about developmental related goals. Now, this is where the systems thinking comes into play. Now, what do we mean by systems change? To put it very simply, it's basically defined as, you know, shifting individual components or parts of a system, but at the same time, not forgetting the pattern of interactions that happen between these various parts. Now, on the right, what you see is a typical, you know, this is like an engineering class or our physics books where we see these levers, right? How it works. Now, you make some change in something, there is a change in the related pattern out there. So ultimately, every system is that way. You can't operate with individual components. You may operate it, but the repercussions of it are felt through the system all through the end. So which is why it becomes extremely important to look at a system in a holistic manner, although we are tinkering with parts of the system. Now, thinking systematically therefore involves seeing the whole rather than just the parts, seeing patterns of change rather than static snapshots, understanding key interconnections within a system and between systems, engaging different perspectives. There is no one single perspective. There are multiple perspectives that need to be kept in mind. In this case, climate and development, right? And of course, there is a constant learning and adaptation that needs to happen. One needs to adapt to the change, because the minute you make some change and this change actually sets in, the new system that comes in place throws in more newer challenges and opportunities. So which is why our constant learning and adapting is very, very important, which is definitely possible only if we are probing assumptions. We can't sit with a single assumption and say, okay, we've done it and this is the way to do it. So that's not going to happen. So obviously you need to have multiple options or a basket of options that need to be kept in mind, kept in the entire narrative when you talk about changing systems like the climate or development or both of them together. Now, the use of a systems lens, why we think it's very important is it will help us to identify what we call as co-benefits or complementary benefits from tackling a combination of individual issues. It will also help us to minimize adverse consequences, which might happen inadvertently, which we call as trade-offs. And obviously, when you don't pay attention to the rest of the system, it might happen. So which is why it is very important to kind of use a systems lens at the end of the day. So if we keep this perspective, then there is a way to kind of look at this entire issue of climate and development in conjunction with each other rather than looking at them in silos. Now, how we would do about it is something I'll talk later. But before I get into that, I just wanted to kind of use two cases here to kind of try and explain the kind of systems interconnections that exist when we are looking at a particular problem. The one example that I'm going to be using is India's green energy ambition, and the second one would be urban development. Okay, so let's look at India's green energy ambition. Although it's called the green energy ambition, it's a little gray because of the way we are pursuing this particular ambition. And so what does it say? As we already talked about, by 2030, we are looking at a 50% installed electric capacity that's from renewable energy sources. Now, we do know that land acquisition is a challenging task in itself. It's already a significant deterrent for deployment of large renewable energy installations. You could be talking about solar farms, you could be talking about wind parks, but then they require land, right? And acquisition of land is an enormous time-consuming, financially challenging, and more than that, there is a lot of competition, which is why it becomes a huge challenge in itself. Now, when we look at the problem, what is it that we are actually looking at? One, as I mentioned, is the increasing competition between solar farms and, say, grazing or pastoral or agricultural land, right? And these are pieces of land which are already faced by the challenges of, say, yield stagnation or, lower productivity levels and increasingly degrading systems. Now, when I say yield stagnation, yield losses, I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is that in India, as of today, about 50% of land is still rain-fed agriculture. So they are subject to the vagaries of climate. It could be late onset of monsoon, it could be an untimely rainfall which could impact yields. Now, there are a whole lot of issues with respect to land, and the land parcels are pretty small, unlike Europe or the US, where you have, stretches and stretches of land that are owned by individuals. But here, our land parcel sizes are extremely small to begin with. Productivity levels are very low. Water source is a problem in itself. And on top of it, there is, soil fertility levels are pathetically low. I mean, it's been denuded, it's been degraded over many, many years. So it has a direct impact on food security. Now, by using more land, let's say for large-scale solar deployment, what also happens is that you end up changing the natural vegetation of some of the areas. If you're kind of removing, trees, completely converting croplands into solar parks and so on and so forth, the entire ecosystem of that place changes. Now, large solar plants obviously come in the way of afforestation efforts. Now, remember the NDC goal, the first goal also talked about increasing forest and tree cover to increase the carbon sink capacity. Now, this is basic school science, which is photosynthesis, right? Now, that's the only process where, carbon dioxide is captured from the atmosphere. And that's why trees are called the natural carbon sinks. Now, when you grow trees, as long as the tree is alive, or even after you harvest the wood and convert it into a form, say maybe doors and windows, or tables and so on and so forth, there is a lifetime to the product. So the carbon is locked in the wood out there. So which is why carbon sequestration is one of the key ways of addressing the problem of climate change when you talk about climate mitigation. One is cutting down emissions from various sectors, but the other is about increasing the carbon sink capacity through natural sinks. Now, if we are using up land for solar, then the land that's available for afforestation, for creating forest and tree cover also shrinks. And interestingly, studies indicate that all these combined factors could actually lead to a net release of carbon. So it's counterintuitive at the end of the day. You're trying to do this because you want to address the problem of climate change. You want to reduce fossil fuel emissions, and that's why you're moving to cleaner energy sources. But the net becomes a release, which completely defeats the purpose. So this is primarily because of a policy oversight. And interestingly, what is also happening in many of the states is that renewable energy projects are classically classified as green projects. So an environmental impact assessment prior to construction is not really mandated. Now, this kind of is a blind spot. So people need to be cognizant that it has multiple impacts across the system. So obviously one needs to kind of screen it in a very careful manner. look at what are the competing demands and also weigh the pros and cons of promoting one over the other and prioritize what essentially is required for that particular region, district, or whatever scale that we are talking about. So that's where the green energy ambition problem kind of brings in the need for systems lens when you're trying to address the problem of climate change. But at the same time, remember, food security is also at stake. So that's a developmental issue. So moving forward, so what's the solution ultimately? Of course, it's not a new problem. Many states have already kind of faced this. So one is, of course, better coordination across various sectors that's required, and also more robust land use accounting. That's the need of the hour. So that would help mitigate the trade-offs that are associated with development of renewable energy projects. The other alternate solutions which have been already explored in some states, like for instance in Telangana, floating solar plants is something that the state is already kind of put up because they have faced a lot of conflict, which is very acute with respect to land. And the other options people are, more and more exploration is happening is for offshore wind and rooftop solar panels. Now, these are the alternate options which need to be kept in mind, keeping the individual land parcel, or for that matter, individual regional specific demands as well as problems that are there in reality. So now let's move on to the next issue that I want to speak about in this context, which is urban development. Now, I know in one of your earlier sessions with Samir, he talked about urban spaces, compact spaces, and, the need for creating, self-sufficient systems rather than, trying to kind of move things from one end to the other. Now, this more or less alludes to a similar kind of thinking here. That's where, it becomes very, very important to kind of look at this problem in its entirety. Now, for instance, we know cities are key areas of interest when we are designing a climate policy because they are actually the hubs of emission-intensive activity. Now, India is urbanizing rapidly, and the most important thing to remember is that half of the future building stock is yet to be constructed, which would happen by 2030. So there's enormous demand for building material out here. So it's a unique opportunity also because you can develop on a low carbon pathway encompassing not just buildings, because for buildings you need cement. That's the construction industry. These have to be transported. So there comes the transport as well. And of course, industrial land, power generation, because you need power also for producing, for kind of constructing, and a whole lot of issues. So there are multiple sectors that come into play the minute you look at an urban system. So it's a huge opportunity to kind of transition into what we call as a low carbon pathway. Now, as I said, it's a challenge, but an opportunity as well. So now, the challenge is, when you're looking at compact urban designs, as opposed to sprawling, say, metropolises like maybe Delhi or other places, you can actually lower the consumption of land and ecosystem. So that's an opportunity here. So when you do that, it is easier. You kind of maintain the natural vegetation as well, rather than raising them down and actually resulting in emissions. Now, more compact cities also have the ability to lower transport emissions, because if planned in a certain way to minimize travel distances between important activity zones, then you're cutting down on your transport requirement, transport fuel requirement, and transport related emissions. And when you're building concrete heavy, poorly vegetated, compact urban areas, what also happens is you're increasing what is called as the urban heat island effect. And it's a problem that many of our Indian cities are already experiencing. So by trying to do something, you are actually creating an alternate problem and you're not even thinking of it. So which is a problem in itself. Now, it would also ramp up, when you create these urban heat islands, you would ramp up the building's cooling energy requirements, which means you're increasing greenhouse gas emissions because you're actually using more power to cool the buildings at the end of the day. So it's a vicious cycle at the end of the day. But at the same time, there are ways to address the problem, which is what needs to be looked at as an opportunity. So how do you actually address it? People have been exploring ways of doing it. One of them is adopting eco-friendly materials, which can indirectly reduce the industrial emissions by lowering the cement demand. Now, producing cement, as you may know, it emits a vast quantity of carbon. It's one of the highly emitting industrial sector, very hard to abate sector as well, because it's an extremely high heat intensive sector. So it makes sense to kind of look at alternate materials. Now, alternate construction materials, it could be, industrial, agricultural, bright products. People are talking about use of fly ash, paper fiber, rice husk, and similar kinds of materials as alternate construction materials. Now, when we end up using these, they lower the demand for cement as well as have other minor ecological benefits. For instance, they relieve the pressure on devastating, ecologically damaging sand mining, which is a key component of the cement production chain. If you look at the value chain of cement, sand mining is an important component. So you kind of address the ecological problem also when you try and explore the alternate solutions for construction material for that matter. So these two examples I thought I could use to kind of establish the linkages between the multiple sectors and how this kind of becomes very, very important when you start looking at the problem in a holistic manner. So I would like to pause here for just a moment and then kind of see if any of you had any pressing thoughts around what we spoke up till now before I move into the next part of my presentation. I'll just take a moment here. Feel free to unmute your mic and then come in and say what you think about what we spoke up till now.
Ma'am, good morning. This is Anjali here.
Yes, Anjali.
For this lovely session. So I was, just thinking right now, you're talking about alternates for cement, right? Which is other very biodegradable products. But we already have, such large business established companies who are producing so much of, cement right now.
Yeah.
What is your take on how they should proceed? And this is one industry, right, where it is already established and they are so what do you call, prominent in the industry that it's not easy to remove that.
Absolutely.
You will face resistance being small timers. So what would you like to say about that?
No, absolutely. I think that's the real world, right? Let's face it. So the point here is that, see, these industries in themselves have been trying to move to much efficient ways of production of cement. It's not that they aren't doing anything. They have been exploring, but then, there is still a bit of the thing. See, one is the production side change. The other is the demand side. It's about, how you and I decide to construct our houses or whatever we are doing, right? So I think there is a change that's required at both the ends. Now, on the production side, as you rightly said, there's a whole lot of investment that's gone in and it's a system in place. It's like, if cement is one example, coal plants, right? The phase out of coal is a huge problem that the entire world and India is definitely talking about, because it's not just about a coal plant, it's about people whose jobs are very closely linked to that. It's about people's lives, it's about livelihoods at the end of the day. So the plan here is that when you're looking at transition, you need to be thinking of multiple ways of addressing the problem. So all we need to do is, yes, it is happening today, but each of these plans have a lifetime also. Can we look at ways in making these extremely efficient up till a point? Obviously, alternate materials cannot be produced at scale overnight. It's going to take some time for these to come up to speed. Up till then, the plants could remain operational. But how do you kind of change the mix? Instead of 100% cement produced in a certain manner, can we make a policy change? Okay, 20% has to be this, or these kind of buildings have to be using these kind of materials. So I think that's the thinking that needs to come into place. And unless we recognize that, we will still be sitting with the thought that, okay, we've already made an investment, let's continue to do what we are doing till the entire thing collapses at the end of the day, right? So that's what I wanted to bring in here. Thanks, Anjali. That's a very valid question.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions in the chat box?
I think there's a comment, Dr. Murthy.
Yeah.
Trees from Parth, trees do photosynthesis, but they also respire like still those are net carbon sink, but with forest fires, it's more of carbon source.
Absolutely. Yes, rightly so, Parth. But the point is, when we're looking at it from an Indian context, forest fires are not really a huge problem. Unlike much of the Western world, be it Australia, be it New Zealand, they do occur naturally. In India, much of the forest fire is man-made fires, and it is controlled to a large extent. It's not as huge. But at the end of the day, the net is what matters, but including, accounting for forest fires, accounting for the respiration which actually emits carbon dioxide, the net is still a sink. There is growth, there is still a carbon sinking that is happening. If you look at India's total carbon sink, the last biennial update report said that India's forest carbon sink capacity is more than 400 gigatons. So we are a net sink at the end of the day, but rightly said, forest fires could result in emissions when it does happen, of course. I do see what can be the challenges for developing a GHG emissions inventory for Indian cities and would be envisioned solution. Okay, with respect to the GHG emissions inventory, I would think data is going to be the biggest challenge at a city level. As you might know, there are emission inventories being developed at the national level, which is coordinated by the MOEFCC, because India, as a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol, has to submit what's called as the National Communications and the Biennial Update Report. Now, as part of this, all sectors of the economy are actually, it is inventorized and it's submitted. Now, there's an independent inventory that is led by a consortium of, that's led by Vasudha Foundation and a consortium of institutions, including C-STEP, do an inventory at a state level, right? So even at a state level, I know for a fact that for the energy sector, there are huge data challenges, particularly with respect to some of the unorganized sector. For example, domestic cooking fuel. That's something that comes to my mind immediately. So, and when you move down to a city level, I am sure it just gets amplified, the data gaps and the data challenges, because that's not really documented or it's not maintained at a city scale. The other thing is, when you're looking at urban systems or cities, one more thing we need to recognize is that much of the production happens elsewhere. Everything comes into the cities. So your production emissions may not happen at where the city is. So who actually pays for it? Where do you account it? Do you account it at the consumption side or you account it at the demand side? So there are multiple issues around that, but it may be possible with some proxies at the end of the day to begin with. Okay, so Ritika, I hope I've been able to, okay, Ritika, yeah, I think, okay, Parth comes back saying forests are not dense enough in same report. Yeah, I mean, see, the density is one part of the story, but the point is, even if it is not so dense, all kinds of forests, some of the forests are not meant to be dense. The scrub forest and the deciduous or the thorn forest, the way they are, they can never become dense. But that's a natural ecosystem that is very much required. That habitat is as important as a rich, thick evergreen forest at the end of the day. So I think, each of them have a role to play, but trees in every patch of forest grows, whether it is dense or moderately dense or open forest, it would still grow and sink in carbon. So I would think, density is just one of the parameters that won't determine whether it is a carbon sink or not. So Ritika comes in with the question, when we talk about new eco-friendly products, is there any methodology or ranks that we can think of to rank them, how much greener they are as an alternative to coal? Well, this would be not just a technology assessment, I think the techno-economic assessment. I myself I'm not aware of this. Probably it might be there. I could look up, and if I do find it, I'll share it with Kaushik to be shared with you. I would definitely do that. Okay, great. Any other questions? Boreal forests are largest carbon sink, although it's less dense. Okay, that's Kaushik responding. Rural and tribal perspectives who are at the receiving vulnerable end. Okay, so I think I'll hold this till the end of the talk when I can revisit this question, Vijayata. So I think I'm going to proceed with my presentation if everyone's okay with it. All right? All right, so let's get back to this. So now, so what do we do at C-STEP? Now, I talked about systems thinking. I talked about the need for it and the challenges in doing it. So I thought, I would spend some time in talking about the work we do. How are we actually trying to address this problem at C-STEP as a policy think tank? Now, as I already mentioned, climate development, they've been looked at in isolation traditionally for a long period of time. But then their interconnections are very large, and it's very, very important to actually look at them in tandem. You can't ignore one and try and do something with the other. So in order to address this, what we've done is we've developed a model called Safari. Now, what is Safari? Safari is nothing but a system dynamics simulation model capable of simulating India's long-term development pathways. It includes developmental goals, materials, energy system, resources, and emissions. Now, what it can help us do is that when I say us, even you could explore it. Towards the end of my talk, I'm going to be sharing a link for you to go up there and explore yourself. You can create and analyze multiple scenarios to build strategies towards low carbon pathways or net zero emissions, although the model as such initially was built for looking at developmental pathways. Now your developmental pathway could be a low carbon pathway, right? It could be a net zero goal that you're wanting to attain. And another thing is that it also identifies leverage points and trade-offs in the system. So this model has the ability to do that. So it's because it's based on a systems thinking. Now, key features of this particular model include achieving the human developmental goals as a metric for development and a key model driver. Now, these drivers are India specific, which I'll come to in a bit. And we've not borrowed global goals and standards. So we've kind of worked out based on literature, based on our discussions with policymakers and multiple stakeholders as to what could be the goal for India. And moving on, this particular model, as I already said, is the system dynamics model. It covers major sectors of the economy, industries, power, agriculture, transport, buildings, and also looks at the interlinkages between them. And it has 80 plus levers that one can adjust to create scenarios. If I have to classify them, we have policy related levers, we have technology related levers, and we also have behavior related levers. Now, I'm sure all of you are reading more and more about the need for behavioral change with respect to all the things that we do, be it the food habits, be it the transport, be it the clothing choices that we make. I think it's becoming a centerpiece to the narrative around achieving climate goals, right? So, and also the circular economy talks about this more often. So there are 80 plus levers one can adjust to create scenarios. So n number of scenarios that one can actually create with this particular model. We also have a fairly good user interactive decision support system, which can help build these integrated scenarios. Now, the desired quality of life benchmarks include, ones with respect to food, housing, healthcare, education, power, water, clean cooking, and transport. Now, as I said, these have been developed keeping in mind where we are today in India and what would actually move us to a desired quality of life, right? So that's the way it's been looked at for the work on Safari. Now, I thought I would just illustrate a few integrated scenarios which we've developed using this particular model. One is a reference scenario. Obviously, when the minute you want to kind of do any kind of modeling, one needs to have a reference scenario. Now, this reference scenario basically looks at, how developmental gaps that exist today are filled. It has no consideration for any environmental indicators, energy or emissions. The only goal is to achieve the desired quality of life, the standards that have been set out there. So that's the reference scenario. The next is to do what we call as the Sustainable Development A scenario. So SDA is nothing but developmental gaps are filled, but at the same time, it kind of takes into, it pulls into play a lot of the technology and efficiency improvements that are required to reduce the carbon footprint. We also have what we call as an SDB scenario, where climate and development are given equal urgency and importance. Behavioral shifts in addition to technology and efficiency that you saw in the SDA scenario are also come into play in the SDB scenario. And then of course you have this overconsumption scenario where India aspires for living the standards and consumption patterns of OECD countries. So this is like, if you do nothing about anything and then you just kind of mimic the West, this is where you're going to end up in. So it kind of helps to kind of put things in perspective with respect to what the different parts, where is it going to lead me to, right? So that is something. I agree there are a whole lot of assumptions that go in here, but at the same time, it helps us to play with these imaginary futures, if I may call them so. But at the same time, it's an imaginary future, but add to it an element of, the policy scenarios that exist today, the kind of futures that are likely to pan out given the kind of current climate commitments the country has, given the developmental pathway that's being talked about within India. So it helps us to kind of develop these various scenarios. Now, the key sectoral levers, if I may call them so, for the Sustainable Development A, SDA scenario, what we look at is across 4 sectors, appliance efficiency, improved efficiency in the industries, use of best available technologies that exist, and in the transport, EV adoption, in agriculture, pumping efficiency is something that's looked at. In the SDB scenario, in addition to all that is looked at in the SDA, what's already also looked at is alternative construction materials in case of buildings, reduced travel demand, and shared and public mobility that kicks in when you're looking at a Sustainable Development B scenario. And of course, in the industry sector, we're looking at material efficiency, circular economy, and a whole lot of bunch of other things when we talk about the SDB scenario. So when you do this, you're able to kind of see, okay, what exactly is important to look at. So as an example, I just put up this result from simulated scenarios. So what we see at the end of the day is that if you're looking at an overconsumption scenario, it obviously is very unsustainable for India because it kind of opens up a Pandora's box. You will achieve your standards of the West or the OECD countries, but you're faced with pollution, water scarcity, resource constraints. So so there are multiple problems that are created if we follow that particular path. So the most impactful interventions or sectoral focus areas that one can kind of adopt based on these model runs is that you can use better construction materials, no new coal power, by which we mean, the existing coal plants continue to operate till their lifetime. The planned ones are also, those in the pipeline also kick in, but then there is nothing new that's added to the entire stock of coal production out there. And of course, improved energy efficiency in industries, increased share of rail in the freight transport and shared mobility. So these seem to have very impactful results with respect to emissions, cutting down the emissions, with respect to also helping to achieve the developmental goals. So that's the way we look at these multiple scenarios. Now I'm going to take up how do we identify trade-offs using the model. As I said, there are feedback loops, causal loops that are inbuilt into this particular model. So the way we do it, and I'll take an example of transport emission mitigation. Now we know, that we are trying to cut down. Our renewable energy share has to increase. That's one of the NDC updated targets as well. So obviously transport emission mitigation is something that has to kick in if we have to make a difference in the power consumption at the end of the day and cut down the transport emissions. So we're talking about electric vehicles, right? As an option to try and address the transport emissions. Now, yes, you can bring in electric vehicles, but that translates to electricity demand increasing, leading to power sector emissions. Now, EV is a great option. But then if you stop thinking at EV as an option for only transport sector, then you're missing out on the larger piece of the problem, which is increasing the emissions from the power sector. Now, this again translates to, so what does that mean? So when you use a system dynamics model, you have the option of calibrating your EV targets. You kind of look at the sweet spot where you're able to look at, you kind of deploy certain electric vehicles, but at the same time, the rate of grid decarbonization is also not missed from the entire storyline that you're looking at. Now, the other alternative thing that's being looked at with respect to transport emission mitigation is talked about quite a bit, and India also has a policy on the biofuels. Now, when you talk about biofuels, the problem that comes in is again land and water constraints that would impact food security. Because biofuels, we are talking about increased area under sugarcane production to produce more of ethanol. Now, sugarcane is a water guzzler. The minute you increase area under sugarcane, you are probably compromising on food production because you're converting land that's under cereals or pulses into sugarcane. You're also kind of utilizing much more water, which already is a problem in India. Groundwater is a huge constraint, and moving forward, it's going to become worse. So obviously land and water constraints kick in, impacting water security the minute you talk about biofuels. So what do we do? So obviously, can we explore ways of blending ethanol targets and calibrate it to make sure the food security is not compromised? Or can we say that we will stop with 2G ethanol rather than moving into, how do you kind of set your targets, right? So that's something one can explore. Now, the other piece of the puzzle when you're looking at the transport emission mitigation is what is called as the compact urban form. Now, the more closer your travel distances are reduced, so your consumption of fuel for transport reduces. So now that's an option in itself. But then the minute you talk about compact urban forms, as I explained earlier, we are talking about increase in cooling energy demand. I talked about the urban heat island, and also increased material footprint of the buildings because you're consuming a lot to build these compact forms. So the solution probably lies in looking at open green spaces, alternative construction material. So can we kind of explore it? So Safari kind of helps us to identify the interventions, but once you identify the interventions to address a particular problem, it also looks at the trade-offs that are very, very important to be kept in mind, and not just look at one singular goal out there. But more importantly, it also helps us to explore strategies to minimize the trade-off. So that is why a systems thinking brings in multiple perspectives that need to be kept in mind when you're trying to look at a solution to a problem at any scale that you're looking at. So to conclude, I wanted to kind of leave you with these thoughts that, the systems thinking framework helps us to explore causes, consequences of action, and aids in design of effective policies. It's like, you don't do something and let time speak for itself. You do it with a certain intent and make sure that the intent is actually achieved and the intent doesn't trigger another problem when it is actually being implemented. So that is what a systems thinking framework can help us achieve. And about Safari, it's a simulator and it's not a predictor. And it also helps us to decide or come up with decisions by creating multiple scenarios and identify the robust strategies. Sometimes, strategies could be only on paper. If it is at a very nascent stage, then, the question comes, do we wait for the perfect technology to come in, or do we make do with what exists today, but at a smaller scale, rather than sitting and waiting for the best technology to kick in? Or can we use a combination, a suite of options to address the problem, right? So that's something we try to look at. And for those of you who are wanting to explore Safari, it's a very interactive interface. It will enable experiential learning and wide engagement and helps enrich the narrative via cross-sectoral dialogue and identify leverage points in the system. So that is the beauty of Safari or any other systems thinking model that could be adopted. So I just wanted to kind of end here saying that, this is the team that worked on developing the Safari. Interestingly, it's an all-women team that's built Safari, and right now my team is looking at making this much more robust by including the forestry sector module also. Right now, Safari is able to simulate up till 2050, but we've expanded it to simulate up till 2100, given that India's net zero is by 2070. So that's something the team's right now looking at. And we're also looking at developing regional models, because the minute you talk about land and water constraints, looking at a national level is one piece of the puzzle. But then these translate to something else the minute you come down into a state or a sub-regional level. So a regional model is also something that the team is trying to look at, barring, deep diving into some of the key sectors that are very, very important to decarbonize at the end of the day. So here is the link to the model. So if you just use the link, it will take you to a page where you get the Safari model. It's open to all, and there is a user guide out here, and you could enter the simulator, and there is a light version for someone who is just wanting to explore it, or there's a beginner mode here, right? Or if you want to explore the much detailed one, feel free to do so. And you could always reach out to us for any questions, anything that you might want to do around the model as well. And we would be very happy to engage with you and then try and see how we could help you walk through Safari or do your own simulations in whichever sector. An interesting thing is you might choose to work with only one sector, but it will still give you the feedback loops across the various sectors. All right, so I would encourage and welcome you all to kindly explore Safari on your own and reach out to us. Thank you very much. Open to questions and discussions around this. I'm going to stop sharing now, of course. I'm sorry, did you people see the interface, or was I just looking at it myself? Can somebody tell me the Safari interface? Was it visible?
It was visible, yeah.
It was visible. Fantastic. Okay, fine. Okay. Any questions? Anything or observations? I do remember I have one question that's up there with respect to the rural systems. I will talk about it after we take up other things, obviously. Yes.
There's a question in the chat box. What's your viewpoint on carbon capture technology?
Interestingly, all our scenarios show that carbon capture and storage and utilization, which is talked about more and more these days, that's something you can't do away with. That's a must in some of the sectors that would be required because, as I said, some of the very hard to abate sectors, probably cement, petrochemical industry, anything you do, the process emissions would still remain because we don't still have the technology and they're extremely expensive ones as of today. So there would be some amount that will still need to be captured. So CCS has to kick in. That is something one can't do away with. People are exploring ways of not just capture, but converting it and using it elsewhere. So I think that becomes very, very important. And I think that is what would help us to achieve net zero when we have to do it. Okay, I'm putting the link for Safari here in the chat box as well for those of you who want to explore. Somebody asked for it. Okay. So I will let people mull over what I said. In the meantime, let me take up that question with respect to urban form and can share insights in the rural and tribal perspective who are the receiving vulnerable. Vijayta, with respect to the rural population, I would think more than climate mitigation, which is cutting down emissions, I think adaptation is something that we need to talk about because these populations are impacted a lot. So where, it is extremely important for, policy makers, decision makers to find ways of buffering the losses due to these adverse impacts of climate change. Now, this would entail developing what we call as climate risk maps, which means, you know what the climate hazard, what is the probability of occurrence of a climate hazard. You also know what are their current vulnerabilities. And thirdly, you have to assess what is the extent of exposure of these systems or people. So once you are able to kind of map that, then you come up with a set of solutions which builds the resilience over a period of time, right? And behavioral shifts is something, people do talk about agricultural cropping pattern change. It's easier said than done. We do know millets are sturdy. They are drought, they're kind of much more sturdier to climate variability and so on and so forth. So, I mean, let's think of a situation where, there is a policy and every farmer is asked to, not every farmer, a large percentage of the farmer is asked to grow these millets. But then the consumption patterns are also there, right? That needs to change. Unless the value chain is developed, you need people to buy it. Otherwise, the farmers are going to remain in the same place. So it's a system change that needs to happen. And it will have to happen at every point in time. Agriculture emissions, yes, pump sets. People are, the government has been promoting, solar powered irrigation pumping and so on and so forth in whatever limited way. So there are efforts happening even at the rural scale. But I would think from a rural perspective, the narrative is more about climate adaptation and building resilience than climate mitigation.
Indu ma'am, I had one question.
Yes.
So I'm also in Bangalore and I'm working on a couple of ideas towards reduction of plastic pollution in cities and based on circularity.
Right.
So my question is, so I'm also thinking about how to integrate all of this into a systems design, etc. So my question is it important at this point in time to cover the entire list of stakeholders that are going to be involved And how important is it for me to integrate everything into my system design at this point in time, or I just limit it to who I feel are the key stakeholders and are going to help me go forward with this. And yeah, so this was my question.
Okay.
So do I approach it like a product development, right? So we first have like an MVP and then we have different versions, or do I look at this approach slightly differently?
Right. So I think you see, one thing is yeah, I mean, the point is, if you want it to be used by various stakeholders, then ideally stakeholder mapping becomes the very important exercise to be taken up. Yes, one can develop and improvise, and like a product development, it could evolve over time. Many a time, it's not static. For instance, there could be a new stakeholder that comes into the entire system the minute a new alternative technology comes in, right? So it could be something that we never thought of, which is why, in the beginning of my presentation, I said it's not static. It has to evolve over time. You need to be relooking at the problem and the solution time and again over a period of time. So yes, stakeholder mapping is important, but then you don't need to wait for getting all of them across the table. You can start small, but you can keep on expanding and adding, the feedback loops, the causal loops. That's something you can build over a period of time. That should be possible. Yes.
Okay, great. If there's no other question, I have a follow-up question. So how do change makers, entrepreneurs like us engage with these steps? So is there any engagement model?
So one is, you could approach us and then we can figure out what is it exactly that you're looking for. So based on which, we could work with you if need be, if you are looking at something large, or if it's some kind of a advisory role, or if it's something that you want us to review, that we're happy to do that as well.
Okay, yeah. I'll get in touch. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think Noreen has her hand raised. Yeah. Yes.
Noreen, you could unmute.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you for such an insightful session. So I am a student of MSc Environmental Science and Management at Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi. The fact that led me to pursuing this course was that I was aiming for a course in climate science and policy, which I could not get a scholarship abroad. So I had to settle for a kind of a generalized course. My interests lie solely in climate change and policy. So I just looked up. I have been like following your organization's work from so long, and I just looked it up, and I am very intrigued by the fact that the most of its like board members in the safari that the simulator you mentioned are women. So I wanted to ask you if you have any provision that you take interns, because I really want to learn under your wing, and climate change and policy is going to be huge in India in the future. Like we need the brightest minds to study this climate change and policy, and I find it very lacking. So I was just asking if you have any provisions that you take interns. Like I am very interested in like learning under your supervision.
Absolutely, Noreen. We do take interns. So if there is an interest area, because sustainable development is such a huge area, right? So, and also I think one more thing that I want to kind of demystify one thing is that, the kind of modelers, the people that you saw have developed the model, not all of them, in fact, not a single one of them have actually studied climate policy and climate science, so to say. Right? So it's a very, it's a thought. Unfortunately, many of us, before we entered the field, think that, in fact, for instance, when Kaushik spoke about, what my background is, no, I haven't studied climate. I studied in the 90s. Climate change was hardly there at that point in time, right? But still, I am where I am today. It's because, the thing is, systems thinking on that sphere is what I spoke about, but then it's also about how do you connect what you study with the environment, with the world that you're working in. I have engineers working with me. I have chemical engineers. I have people who are microbiologists who worked on biofuels, etc., working with me. I have people who's done social science working with me. See, because, everybody has a space. See, climate is something that touches every single sphere of life, right?
Exactly.
So obviously, we need people who understand these various systems. The sum of the parts is what makes up the climate at the end of the day. So if we have to address the problem, we need to have various people looking at the problem. So please, who in this group, I would suggest that, if you think you're studying something, but you want to work in climate, you feel you're ill-equipped because you don't have a degree in climate science, I think don't, throw it out of your mind. Find opportunities like what you're doing today to kind of get connected with the right set of people who are doing work in the spheres. Do your internships, see if that is really where you want to pursue something. And once you get into that sphere, you will understand that, even you can play an important role out there. And to put the thing short, I would say, yes, as an intern, you're welcome to approach us. We would be happy to take you or others who would be interested in working for a 3-month, 6-month, or a large project kind of a thing, what you might want to submit to your as part of your course. We're happy to support that. Reach out to us.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes, Shubhi.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. So, since you talked about carbon capture technology, I wanted to ask if Safari includes that part in modeling scenario as well.
Yeah, I mean, Safari does not include the carbon capture. It looks at the emissions, right, at the end of the day. So, even doing the perfect technology, very energy efficient systems, if it still comes down to some level of emissions, then we say yes, CCS is something that we need to include. Right now, it's kind of hidden somewhere, but it's not exclusively there as part of the modeling sphere.
Okay. I had another question.
Yes.
So you also talked about CCUS utilization part. So I'm a chemical engineer by profession. I've been reading about what ONGC and Shell has been doing regarding CCUS. So what they do is they utilize the carbon capture in digging out more oil. And how do you think that will play a role in net zero emissions, considering they are using carbon to emit more carbon? And the recent report by an organization said that Shell's carbon capture plant emitted more carbon than it absorbed.
Oh, wow. Okay. I mean, these are things that do happen. So obviously, again, when we say utilization, don't just put a blanket statement as to utilization. I think one needs to be careful as to where it is utilized, how it is utilized. For instance, plastic. People are exploring ways of utilizing plastic for making roads, other produce, etc. Right? So I think it's about how best you can use it without actually triggering something else. What you said, if that's happening, that's not really the solution. It seems like a solution, but then it's a problem. It continues to be a problem, but it's quite possible, of course, if the report that you said is true, that Shell actually emitted more than what it captured, then that's a sad story. But it's quite likely that, in some cases, they might utilize it for doing something, but the net is still lower than what it emitted at the first instance. So in that case, it's still a little, I would say, a win-win to a large extent. So it depends. It has to be looked at case by case.
Yeah, Shell actually denied that report is true. That report was a foundation from there. So, no one knows what is true there.
Possible.
But since you talked about using plastic as a material for road, I wanted to understand the system thinking approach to that. Because as much as I understand, if you build road using plastic, won't microplastic enter into the food and water system? I mean, if we think holistically about the whole process we are using.
Yeah, I see. My team is just beginning work on this. So if you're wanting to come and join us and explore that, feel free to reach out to us, and we would be happy to kind of pull you in and then see how we can make use of your expertise, your thinking in the work that we are doing.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yes. Yes, Kunal. I saw a raised hand of Kunal, but it's gone down, maybe by mistake.
Yeah,
Yes,
Kunal,
yes.
we can't hear you, but you may want to check the mic or put your question in the chat box if that's not possible.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Ma'am, thanks a lot for that session. It was quite insightful. I had a similar question when asked in the mid half that about inventory of Indian cities. I had a follow-up question for that, ma'am. We usually see that India has committed for that net zero of 2070. When looking at the whole holistic approach, dividing into sectors and bringing it down, but when you go on the ground and when you walk off the street, when we commit for net zero, we see that India is completely going to set for carbon neutral. So then, how do we deal with the stalls that are around the roadside? Or India is, if we specifically deal with the Indian cities, the reality is that there is a whole lot of urban sprawl that is around the roads, which happens. So when it comes down to urban accounting of those people, like how does one go ahead with it, or how does can we that could be tackled? Because when it comes to energy discoms, there's an accounting happening at a higher levels.
Right.
Let it be PAT, let it be CBC, or the other policies that have been coming into picture. But when it comes to very small stage, when we do the 10 rupees and UPI coming into picture, how do you can you put a line of it? It would help us.
Yeah, no, very valid. I think that's where the roadmap to achieving net zero becomes very, very important to actually chalk out, right? So now it's just a commitment right now. So it cannot be done overnight. It requires a phased transition plan that needs to be in place. So which means, all sectors, all regions, every scale has to kind of match up. So given that, I think India, we're still very far from there, because we're still grappling with a whole lot of other challenges. So policymakers are yet to kind of get there. So city level, yes, it needs to be done, but then the accounting is as challenging, which means you need to build skills of people to actually monitor, document in the first place, because without that, we won't be able to do anything. So that itself is the first step that needs to be done. Post which, you talk about how do you address the problem. Now, the interesting thing is, again, there's one other problem that came to my mind when you were talking about urban sprawls, waste. Especially waste is something that comes on the top of the mind. Are you from Bangalore? Then you would be thinking about waste. In any case, yeah, I'm sure every city has the same problem.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's also to do with air quality, right? We are trying to address air pollution. We have a National Clean Air Action Plan, NCAP. Now, under this, every city has to kind of have only admissible levels are certain. So obviously, there is a whole lot of action around air quality that's happening in major cities of India. So they're doing a lot of efforts. A lot of these are also climate, friendly. When I say climate friendly, they are helping to address the problem of climate change. So that's the thing. We need to look at various policies, various programs that are happening in silos today to see how do you integrate all of this to look at sustainable development, right? That's the larger umbrella under which we need to do. I don't have a ready answer as to how we can do it, but these are my broad thoughts, at least I can think of as soon as you ask the question.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. That would surely
help. There's a question in the chat box.
Yeah.
Ms. Murthy. So what are the good data sources for researching India's transition towards net zero emissions, asked by Saurabh?
There is nothing like a data source. All you would find is, maybe journal papers or articles in the newspaper or reports published by various, some academic institutions, some policy think tanks like us, which will help you to kind of understand the narrative around it, right? So that is something that you might be able to find. Data per se, as I said, net zero commitment is very recent. It's just a year back that we committed, but there is a lot that still needs to be done. So it's all kind of emerging now. So post COP27, we will know, because there could be some pressure on India, something to be done immediately. The long-term strategy, as Kaushik mentioned, is something that's being discussed now, the low carbon strategy for transition. So I think all of that would determine how India decides to kind of look at how we transition, what are the things that need to be there, and so on and so forth. I think Kaveri has asked about examples of systems thinking from India. In a way, I'm feeling sad to say this, but I'm also happy because I think we are one of the very few groups who are looking at long-term scenarios from a systems thinking. WRI does, it did publish something, I think a year back. So probably WRI and C-STEP are the two places where you would be able to get some resource with respect to application of systems thinking in looking at long-term scenarios. Otherwise, largely it's been cost optimization models that have ruled the roost so far. That is how it's been up till now. Anybody else? I mean, there's nothing silly or nothing basic about any of the questions. I think it's a conversation that we are having. So please feel free to switch on your video or unmute your mics and then go up and ask your question. Or even contest something that I said. If you think, no, this is not doable. This is not something that's realistic. Can we even do this? Feel free to comment there. Saurabh, we can't hear you. Yes.
Okay, all right. So I was wondering, any work done on built environment side, any systems thinking approach there, or any case study which has been worked on? I'm a faculty in School of Built Environment.
Okay.
And I research on green buildings. Very keen to know, any work.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Saurabh. So as part of the Safari work, we have a couple of publications. That web link that I shared you will also lead you to the publications from this particular work. So urban form is definitely one of the things that's been explored in this work. Pan-India level, of course. So you might want to look it up and then, reach out to us for anything more that you would want to discuss or explore more, or even add value to what we are doing. Insights being, you being from that particular sphere would definitely be welcome.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Dr. Murthy, I have one question. This is more from the point of view of understanding or keep tracking as a layperson of what we call climate goals for our country or for the world, right? So we recently attempted to sort of put together a few reports to be read before COP27 for everyone to understand. And it still is a massive number of reports, like 10 different reports, right? And one report talks about NDCs, one report talks about something else. I feel that the communication around the climate goals, when it comes to for a layperson, for someone coming from a non-climate education or work experience, so what are the ways we can do it in a way that's more easier for people? Because many of my friends who follow COP27 now say that it's full of jargon that we don't understand. Like it's hard to decipher what's being talked about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, in response to that, one thing I can give you, I can't tell you the date, but I will definitely convey to you, which you can send out to your friends and the people here in this room, is that, post COP26, we did an event around, for school students and, general public, which is basically, breaking COP26 into simple bites for the people, general public. What does it mean for you and me, right? So what does it even mean? If India is doing something, obviously it filters down to every single one of us. So we are going to be doing an event early December, probably just after the COP. I can definitely kind of send it out to you so that you can get people to kind of attend it. With respect to the communication, as you rightly said, like in much of the fields, even this field is filled with a lot of jargons, and people have to be following these very closely to understand what's even being talked about out there, which is quite unfortunate. But I do see more and more organizations trying to kind of communicate climate change in a way that every person can understand. So now how do you, in my perspective, people understand only when they can relate to it. So it has to be at a scale. When I say scale, both spatial and temporal scale at which people can relate to. For instance, if I say, climate is going to change, right, in the next 30 years, about 2-degree increase in, say, Bagalkot district of Karnataka. Now, if there is anyone in this group who hails from that particular district, it immediately makes them sit and wonder, okay, what does it mean? Okay, does that mean if they belong to a farming community, what happens to my cropping system? My parents live in a asbestos or a tin-sheeted place, or they are laborers. How are they going to work? So it kind of triggers those questions. So the relatability is the key to getting people to understand climate change. Time scales and then spatial scales to begin with. So to kind of help that endeavor, we at CSTEP have published, so at CSTEP, of course, climate, environment, sustainability, one is the kind of work that I spoke about at length till now that we do. But we also do climate modeling and climate adaptation and risk analysis. So on the climate modeling space, if you go to the CSTEP website and look up, we have climate atlases at a district level for all the states of India that we've published, where we are talking about how the temperature and rainfall has changed in the past 30 years, which is between 1990 to 2019. And we've compared the next 30 years, that is 2021 to 2050, with the past, and said, as compared to the previous 30 years, which will be much of the lifetime of everybody in this room, you're going to be probably experiencing a 1 degree to 3 degree increase in whichever district you are going to be. Now, please remember, these are averages again, so it could be plus or minus. But largely what we see is that we are getting into a warmer and a wetter future. So that's where, the conversation begins. Okay, if we are looking at a warmer and better future, what does it mean to the space that I'm working in, the food that I eat, the place that I live in, the way I commute to do my work? So I think these are the points of communication that needs to be there. Now, that's with the general public and students. But then when we are talking to the policy makers, in my experience, what I've found that really makes them notice what you're saying or accept that, okay, yes, this is something I need to worry about, is again, one is, of course, relatability in time and space. The other is to do with their investments being at stake. Large scale investments, the cost factor, the finance of it is something that would be very, very important. So the cost benefits of doing something today versus 5 years or 10 years later is something that they would be happy to understand, and they can relate to, and they say, okay, it makes a difference. So I think, and related to the lives and livelihoods, it's going to impact so much of population. If you do this, you're going to buffer it by 50%. The crop loss would decrease by 25% if you make this switch. So I think that is something that works. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on this space, but small steps already being taken by different groups of organizations.
Hello, I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is not actually a question. I want to study about the biofuel condition in India.
Yes.
Because I'm not from India. I live in Indonesia, in Jakarta.
Right.
So I'm working on a biofuel policy. So the Indonesian government, it is heavily rely on palm oil. So we are trying to find like a diversification, scheme to it. So I want to understand more about what is happening in India. Is it like diverse enough for the biofuel feedstock, or what are the current policies going on in India? Like, are they incentivizing a specific feedstock or what? And ma'am, Indu, can you please if we can communicate, I want to ask for some literature so I can understand Indians' perspective, because we are the same developing countries, right? So we can actually learn from each other. So yeah, that's what I want. That's why I'm joining this very insightful seminar. So
Okay.
that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ria. Thanks for that. So I am just leaving my mail ID in the chat box for all. So whatever your reason for connect, whether it's for literature, it's for understanding, it's for clarification, or for internships, please do reach out to me on this mail ID. I will send out things that whatever we have access to, or point you to data sources that you might want to kind of look up. Happy to do that. Reach out to me on that mail ID.
I think we have come to the end of the scheduled time for the masterclass. I think it's a good time to conclude and end. Thank you so much, Dr. Murthy, for your time today. It has been very insightful and engaging session. I'm sure we continue to want to bring you to do more of such masterclasses to unpack this ecosystem. And we have a lot of audience who would also want to know more about transitioning into this sector, which is where Climate Asia plays a major role. We will talk more about that. Thank you so much for today's time, and thank you everyone for participating and engaging with us today on the weekend. Climate Asia will also post this masterclass online, and it will be available for everyone on all our social media handles and on our YouTube channel.
Thank you, Kaushik. My pleasure. Very happy doing this and interacting with all, and happy to continue the interactions as well. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Take care.